So first is this idea, the Millennial Generation. So millennials, folks call them different things, but they're the generation born around 1982, graduated high school in 2000. They're driving cultural shifts that demand a new kind of leadership that will be important to the future of learning for our students. And this is their facility with technology. So we're seeing a lot of this idea of reverse mentoring, where young people are mentoring older people about how to use social media, how to use new technology to advocate for a cause. We're seeing the comfort with collaboration and expectation of transparency that I think partially comes with new technology. And we're seeing an embrace of diversity, an expectation of diversity, and then a value of the competence and results over titles and hierarchy. So this isn't the yes sir, no sir generation. It's the excuse me, but I think we might be a different way to do this generation. At the same time, we're seeing this generation think differently about their role in democracy, where there's a Hart Research Associates poll where 65% of the millennials saw ordinary people as better equipped to solve problems than an authority figure or experts. So it's a real shift. This is part of that shift from command and control to community and relationship, where if we think about solving democratic problems, that ordinary people are better equipped to do it. And I had one of our students that was in this program at Miami University that Byron came and did the workshop with. She said, I learned that yes, I could lead a group of people, one me and the rest followers. I could do that. But how much better would it be if we were a room full of leaders? And I think this kind of represents and captures that shift that's taking place. And because of this, we're seeing, I think, college students really thinking critically about what democracy looks like on campus. You know, in some ways it starts at home. And my favorite story of what democracy means comes from Miles Horton asked Jane Addams, who was a settlement house pioneer, said, you know, how do you understand democracy? And Jane Addams said, you know, if a group of people are sitting around a country store and there's a problem that needs to be solved, there's two things they can do. They can go and ask an expert to solve the problem for them, or they can try and solve it themselves. If they try to solve it themselves, that's democracy. And Horton was impressed, and he asked her, you know, where did you get that idea of democracy? And Jane Addams said, well, I got that from my father, who served in the state legislature with Abraham Lincoln. So this is an idea that goes back to the founding principles of U.S. democracy, and I think it's very much alive in our college students. And David Matthews, when Kettering Foundation did a study of college students, he had this insight about sometimes students learn what politics is in class. Most of the time they learn politics from the way it is practiced on campus. So the really low level of tolerance for hypocrisy and really a calling out of our institutions to practice what we're preaching, I think is a part of involving students as co-creators in this work. And then kind of this last justification I talked about is the untapped resources of our students. You know, we're not likely to see massive expansion of staffing on campus. We're seeing, in fact, budget cuts. And I don't want to argue that students should be an excuse for these cuts, but it does allow us to think creatively about the role of students in creating an engaged campus. Specifically around service learning, civic engagement. I know CSU doesn't have a service learning, civic engagement center at the time, but it actually allows you to think creatively about what could be the role of students in creating a center like that. Here's a pyramid that comes out of one of our projects, Students as Colleagues, where we looked at what are the different kinds of roles that students are playing on campus where they are an untapped resource and playing a leadership in engagement work. So kind of a base level is seeing students as staff and seeing students as kind of staffing centers, doing kind of real work on campus, but doing some of the staffing application. Next level is leading students as reflection leaders and playing a role of liaisons with community partnerships, and then leading reflection sessions for younger students and kind of mentoring them along the way. Next level is the real engaged student-faculty partnerships. So where students and faculty are doing engaged research together. And then another level is students doing engaged scholarship on their own with support and mentorship from faculty, staff, and other folks on campus, but really being the kinds of engaged scholars that we want to see on campus. I want to give you a couple examples. So Byron had asked me about some practical things that you might bring. So I want to talk about the way some schools are actually putting this idea into practice. Really reconceptualizing how students can be colleagues in this work in really practical ways. So one of the first examples is, and I'm a big advocate of this, is that this is something that doesn't require new money, and I think you actually are doing some of this, is that so many, on our college campuses, we give away a lot of scholarship money. Often when we're recruiting students to come there or giving scholarship money, we're giving it to students who have experience with service. That's part of what we expect, and we're rewarding that with some scholarship funds. Very often, we offer this scholarship money, bring them to campus, and then don't ask them to play a leadership role on campus. So we're offering the funding, and then they do their academic work, but they don't have a leadership role to play because they're getting this scholarship. And that would be the equivalent, I think, of if we recruited someone because they're a really talented basketball player, gave them a scholarship to come to school to play on the basketball team, or give them a scholarship because they're a basketball player, and then not ask them to play on the team when they're there, even though they're getting the scholarship. So I think scholarship funds is an untapped resource. And schools like Bentley, IUPUI, DePaul, the whole Bonner Foundation program is built on this model of using scholarship funds to support engagement work. I know in student affairs that you do that. I think you give scholarship funds to students that play a leadership role, and I think that's an important asset. A second piece of this is community work study. So we have work study funds. Our students were required by federal law to use at least 7% in community-based work study. There's an opportunity to create programs where students are playing a leadership role using existing funds with community work study. There's a really interesting program at UC, at San Diego, at their Center for Community and Service Learning that does that and has a whole training around it. So it's a developmental process. The next model is this idea of students serving as a staffing for offices of service learning. So very often, offices of service learning are maxed out in terms of what they can get done. So they utilize the resources of students in staffing their offices. They do it at Miami-Dade with a student ambassador program. At Providence College, what we do is we have a program where we have community assistants and community liaisons. And these are upper class students who've had experience in a class and done service learning, and then they act as the liaisons with different community partners. So we have an upper level experienced student who's working usually for a year with a community partner and working with the students and mentoring the students and essentially acting as a volunteer coordinator for the community organization and a reflection leader for us and helping us integrate that work that the students are doing in the community onto campus. So another model is around, I talked about student-faculty partnerships. One school, Hofstra University, and this doesn't cost much money, but out of their provost's office, they have this small fund where any faculty can ask to have a student act as a peer teacher in their course to play some kind of a leadership role. And that student gets a small stipend. It's not very much. It might be $400 or $500 for the semester. But they are helping the faculty in some ways have an engagement component to the course. And this is, so they have to apply, they have to have a student in mind who's usually someone who's taken the course, who would then kind of act as an engagement TA in the course. And there's a real liaison within the curriculum to students. And that makes a big difference. Almost every course that I teach, I have students teaching with me, either acting as coaches in a community organizing class or co-teaching a course that they've taken with me. And it changes the dynamic because they're able to, I bring a certain expertise, but they're able to connect with students in a way that I can't. So it adds a whole new layer to this idea of co-creating learning together. Another model, which is a bit more radical, is a professorless classroom. And at UMass Amherst, they run all their alternative spring break program is done through a curriculum. So it's not a co-curricular model. And the faculty is working and has a course with all the student leaders who are leading ASB trips. And then those student leaders are teaching the course for the students that are going on the ASB trip. So it's kind of like a scaffolding program where students are actually teaching the course, and it's a professorless classroom, but they're getting real guidance and mentorship from a senior faculty. And then another model of this student-faculty partnerships, and this is happening all over the place. One of the kind of leading institutions that's been doing this is really thinking about philanthropy and teaching students philanthropy by creating classes where the classroom becomes the agency that's offering money to communities. And it's often, they could study, actually it's happened in different disciplines. At our school we have actually a philanthropy course where students are giving away small pockets of money to community-based organizations. So they're learning the right questions to ask. They're learning deeply about who's doing great, really cutting-edge community-based work. And they're giving resources to the community in terms of funding. So that's another model that we've seen. In terms of student-engaged scholarship, I think these are kind of capstone, many universities have capstone courses where they're building an expectation of some kind of a publicly engaged thesis into the capstone course. Stanford's been doing this for a long time with a year-long public service scholars program. But a bunch of universities are also thinking about how the capstone experience can connect with real-world problem solving. There's a program called Public Achievement, which involves young people in coaching other young people in tackling problems they care deeply about. And then a really interesting idea is social entrepreneurship is kind of a buzzword. And at Western Kentucky University, they have this idea of the $100 solution, where students can think about what they could do with $100 to really implement and make a difference on some kind of social issue. So these are kind of some of the examples that I wanted to present to you. These examples and this model doesn't come without challenges. So I wanted to raise two of the kind of major challenges. And the first is that this idea of this administrator said, by building this stuff, by institutionalizing student leadership, it's like putting a pin on a butterfly. And Goodwin Liu wrote about this. He said, institutionalization gradually shifts control and resources away from students to people who have formal power and bureaucratic authority on campus. So there's a question whether or not institutionalization has dampened student leadership on individual campuses. So as you institutionalize this work, do you actually take away power from students? I think is one. And then the second is, and I think Byron is kind of a leading figure in thinking about the impact on communities of this work. And I know Byron has told me the story of, any idea that a student has to do that comes from campus, there's somebody in the community who has the same idea or who's been thinking about this and trying to implement it for a long time. Part of our work is just to bring them together. With student leadership and really building student leadership, are we in some ways taking ownership further away from the community and giving ownership to the most transient and least experienced on campus? There's Dick Cohn wrote about this, about the fears that students would use their service experiences to acquire skills and knowledge that they can use to further disenfranchise those already disenfranchised. So these two challenges are in this chart. So if you look at this chart, you see that there's this trade-off, and I think it's important to think through this, and this might be something to think about at your roundtable, is what are the trade-offs between student leadership and institutional support? And think about where are your programs right now on that trajectory, where would they ideally be? I don't think there's a right answer, but there are trade-offs in terms of student autonomy and in terms of institutionalization. And at the same time, I think there's trade-offs between this, really embedding this work in the curriculum and having it be focused on a cause and what is most important to students. So these are some of the trade-offs that are kind of embodied in this part. And I have students as colleagues in the middle. And sometimes when I do workshops with this, I'll ask folks to say, think about a program where it is now and then where you'd ideally like it to be. So I don't think there's a right answer of where you are in this chart, but I think it's important to think through where your programs are now and where they might move to. So moving forward, I want to just kind of, out of this work comes, I think, 4 rethinking the role of students in this work, really thinking about students as colleagues, I have three different really central pieces to this. One is empowering students to name their work on civic issues for themselves. And I had mentioned when I went around the country and talked to students and listened to them, when they talked about the work they were doing on campus, it was often in their own language. So it wasn't using the language of social science. So they didn't name it civic engagement. They definitely didn't name it politics. But they were doing work that we would probably understand as civic engagement, political engagement. So I think it's important to create space for student voice, for them to name the work they're doing for themselves on their own terms. A second piece, and I think this is especially important at a school like CSU, where you have students who are working, and you have commuter students and have families and have other obligations, is that we need to build in opportunities for longer term engagement and incentives to do that.